Hi, I'm Chip, the pastor here at Union Church, and today we're continuing our series in the book of Proverbs, today at what makes a good neighbor. At its core, Proverbs is like a user's manual. It's some performance tips from the engineer who designed us on how we were made to operate and how we run well. So our movement this morning will be looking first at Proverbs' advice about neighbors and being a good neighbor generally. And then second, specifically, what God has to say about being a good neighbor. This is the book of Proverbs, and so we'll be reading a number of different Proverbs that touch on that theme of being a good neighbor. Proverbs 3, verse 28 tells us, "Do not say to your neighbor, 'Go and return tomorrow, when I will give it to you, when you have what they ask for there.'" Proverbs 12, verse 26. "One righteous guides his neighbor. The way of the criminal is erring." Proverbs 14, verse 21. "The one who shows contempt for his neighbor misses the mark. The one who provides for the poor is happy." Proverbs 21, verse 10. "The breath of the criminal desires evil. His neighbor will find no compassion in his eyes." Proverbs 27, verse 10. "Your neighbor and the neighbor of your father don't abandon, and don't go to your brother's house in a day of distress. Better a dweller nearby than a brother far off." Proverbs 27, verse 14. "The one who blesses his neighbor in a great voice at the early rising of daybreak, and it will be thought as a curse of him." I want to start by asking a question, and that is, who is your neighbor? I used to think of a neighbor in a hypothetical way, like those who were nearby you, whether by phone or work. But COVID has caused us to reconsider that, hasn't it? We can't go anywhere at any time. And so each of our actual neighbors who live next door to us are around a lot more, and they're a lot more important in our everyday life. Proverbs 27:10 says it this way: "Don't forsake your friend and your father's friend, and don't go to your brother's house in the day of calamity. Better is a neighbor who is near than a brother who is far away." In a certain sense, our phones and computers can collapse our relational distance. You can Zoom your brother or sister halfway across the world, but in a day of distress, you need those closest to you. We respond emotionally to being physically present with other people. The word for neighbor in Proverbs is also a word similar to a close friend, someone who is in close proximity to you. We hear in the Proverbs, "Better are these peers nearby than a sister or brother far away." So what advice does Proverbs give to us about being a good neighbor to those you live next to? Well, to be honest, as we just read, Proverbs doesn't have just one thing to say. But one of the pieces of advice we receive is that being committed to those around you really helps. When it says don't forsake your friend or your father's friend, there's an understanding that it's good to be involved in the long-term good of a community, even to your parents' generation, and honoring their friendships. I think this is hard to do today because when we jump in our cars or jump on our computers and go directly to our work, or when we go out for a walk but we still bury our heads in our phones, we sometimes forget to see how those around us are doing. And it's really important for our neighbors to know us and for us to know them. And so I give you this encouragement. When you're with someone, put your phone down. Whoever you're texting can wait, because God is encouraging us and telling us that the neighbor nearby us matters more. Besides being committed, Proverbs also recommends being considerate. Chapter 3, verse 28 says, "Don't say to your neighbor, 'Go and come again, and tomorrow I will give it,' when you have what they want then." Now, what I thought about as I was reading this week was, don't be Homer Simpson. That is, don't hold on to Ned Flanders' weed whacker when you actually have it in your garage right behind you. But seriously, the Proverbs is actually echoing something a bit more self-seeking than that, and that is withholding someone's wages. That is, don't say to your neighbor, "Go and come, get the money I owe you tomorrow," when you have the money there. Which is to say, stop just thinking about when you're talking to your neighbors what you want to talk about, and be considerate of their concerns. So, for instance, when you ask your neighbor, "How are things going?" once in a while, actually have the time to stop and have them answer you. On a simple level, maybe being considerate means just, keep the noise down. One of my favorite Proverbs says, "Whoever blesses his neighbor with a loud voice, rising early in the morning, will be counted as cursing." There's an understanding that being a good neighbor doesn't mean that you always have to have the closest relationship with your neighbors, because if that was the case, they might distract you from what you needed to get done. But it does mean being concerned about how your actions, how your choices in life are impacting those around you. And so if we could summarize what Proverbs saying about neighbors and being a good neighbor, it's asking us to love our neighbors as ourselves. We actually find this exact encouragement in both Leviticus chapter 19 and then again in Luke chapter 10. As a summary of every other piece of advice throughout the scriptures that God has given to his people. God encourages us, love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor as you would want to be loved. Today we might say it as walk in other people's shoes, or do unto others as you would have them do unto you. This isn't earth-shattering advice, and it doesn't have to be really good advice. We remember as we're reading the Proverbs that some of this insight and wisdom comes from Egypt and other parts of the world when it was written. Proverbs' barometer is to love your neighbors as yourself. But there's a couple challenges to following through on the golden rule. The first problem is, what if people do want to be just left alone? Now, I confess, I don't think everyone in New England is like this, but I often feel loved by just being left alone. And that is, just leave me alone and let me do my own thing. But the challenge there is, does loving my neighbor like myself mean just leaving others alone? Proverbs 12:26 answers, "One who is righteous is a guide to his neighbor, but the way of the wicked leads them astray." What I need, what our neighbors really need, what we really need, is someone next to us who will go beyond just being considerate or committed, but people who will consistently care for us, be persons of intentionality and integrity, there for us when we need them. One of the ways that this really comes out is in hospitality. We may say that we want to be left alone, but everyone loves sharing a meal. And it's much easier to share food or snow shoveling or pet sitting or whatever, babysitting with those who live next door than having to call a friend to come 30 minutes away. We may say we want to be left alone because we're fearing rejection, but it's not true. We want neighbors who are good to us. So first, be good to your neighbor. The second problem and thing that hinders us in actually living out the golden rule is that we live in a broken world. What if the world is so broken? What if we're so fractured and segregated that we never really have to see those who have real needs around us, whether it's not having enough opportunities to work or a place to live or food to eat? What if we can sit in our own homes and avoid having inconvenient neighbors? Proverbs 14, verse 21 challenges us. Whoever despises his neighbor misses the mark, but the one who is righteous to the poor is happy. That language of missing the mark in verse 21 is the same language used to describe sin. What being a wise neighbor means is having a standard of transformative mercy that transcends treating just our neighbor around us the way we want to. It instead is proactive and realizes that there are those that we don't see right now in our lives that are lonely and are poor and cannot be left alone. It's a reminder that we ourselves are lonely and often spiritually poor and do not want to be left alone. We cannot afford to be left alone. And so we can't just help those in our immediate proximity, but we need to seek out those around us, our neighbors with real needs. I challenge you to find a way to care for those less fortunate right here in Whittington today. Maybe it starts with just donating to the Deacons Fund, 100% of which goes to the needy right here in our neighborhood. Maybe it means coming to the church with a need that you see and helping us as the church begin to meet that need. God wants us to actually love our neighbors and ourselves, and this requires being constantly creative for all the different situations that our world throws at us. When loving your neighbor as yourself is discussed in the Bible, it always comes paired with another encouragement, and that is to love God with your whole heart. Jesus tells us a story explaining this connection, and it's the story of the Good Samaritan. It's the story of a traveler finding a human beaten and lost, having been preyed upon by robbers and left to die on the road. He's been stripped of his clothes, beaten to within an inch of his life, and he's half dead already. And so what the traveler does is he stops, he cleans his wounds, he gives him a place to live until he is better, no doubt here at great expense to himself, and even risks himself being among the robbers and staying on the road to help out. And many times when we read this story, we picture ourselves as the Good Samaritan. But the Good Samaritan in this story is God. Christ has come down from heaven to be with us, to take care of us, the ones that are hurting and lost. And it's Jesus that gives us the perfect example of what it means to be a wise neighbor. And so it's for this reason that loving God is of paramount importance in loving our neighbor as ourselves. When we come across those in need, we're not frightened away and try to look away, because we know the core of our identity is people who have received mercy from God, and so can't help but spill out and have compassion on those around us. It's God's compassion that changes every interaction we have with our neighbors. So what I want to do is end with this question for you. Is your heart driven by compassion or judgment for those around you? Do you find yourself loving your neighbor as God loves you, loving those who are in deep need and those that live next door to you because you've received the mercy of God and no longer desire evil, as Proverbs 21 verse 10 says? Or are you intentionally avoiding those opportunities? God challenges us this morning that of those who have richly received and are experiencing the compassion of Christ, we can't help but, like a cup overflowing, extend that charity and compassion and joy to all those around us. beginning with our neighbors.